In October of 1347, when the late light lay flat on the water of Messina's harbor, a Genoese galley glided in with its oars shipped and its sails hanging like tired linen. The dockmen, bronzed men with rope-burned hands, waited for the usual barking of orders, the familiar bustle of unloading. Instead, there came a silence that carried across the pilings. A boy ran along the quay and stopped short, staring up at the rail. Sailors slumped there as if asleep, their faces waxed, their lips dark. One man tried to stand, as if remembering what a body is for. He swayed, and the fall of him made no more sound than a sack of grain. When the first living officer descended, he did not ask for wine or women or news. He asked for a priest. The priest, stepping closer, saw swellings in the groin and under the arm, as large as eggs, bruised into the color of rot. The air itself seemed changed, thick with bilge, sweat, and something sweeter, like fruit left too long in a closed room. In a city that had grown accustomed to the importation of pepper and silk and rumor, death had arrived as cargo. Europe in the 14th century did not feel itself precarious. It felt itself eternal. The cathedral stones rose as if they would outlast time. The manor, the guild, the parish, the rhythm of sowing and harvest, all seemed stitched into a world order guaranteed by God and custom. Yet under this apparent fixity ran currents of strain. Population had expanded through the high Middle Ages until land was crowded and margins were thin. Climatic shifts and poor harvests had already chastened the continent. Famine earlier in the century had taught men what it meant to watch a child's body shrink and to bargain with providence. War moved like a chronic fever through regions, armies living off the land, displacing peasants, stuffing towns with refugees. Cities were swelling, dense with humanity and animals, with refuse in the streets and water drawn from wells that lay too close to latrines. Commerce knit the Mediterranean and the North Sea to the Black Sea and beyond, a triumph of enterprise that also became a triumph of contagion. It was not an age waiting for disaster. It was an age in which disaster had been rehearsed, and the stage was set. The malady that later generations would name the Black Death was not born in Europe. Its deep origins lay in the ecology of rodents and fleas across the breadth of Eurasia, in the intimate, unnoticed transactions between parasite and host. Modern knowledge would speak of Yersinia pestis, of flea vectors and bacteremia. Medieval knowledge spoke of corrupted air, divine wrath, and unlucky conjunctions of planets. The two languages, though different, describe the same human predicament, that men are vulnerable to what they cannot see. Along the trade routes that connected China and Central Asia to the western end of the continent, goods moved, and with them the small stowaways of disease. Whether in caravans crossing steppe and desert, or in ships hugging coastlines, the plague traveled with the patience of nature and the speed of commerce. There is a famous scene, half history and half symbol, in the Crimean port of Kaffa, where a Tatar army besieging the Genoese colony in 1346 was struck by pestilence. Chroniclers later told that the besiegers hurled infected corpses over the walls, an early brutal gesture toward what we would now call biological warfare. Whether the tale is exact in its details matters less than what it reveals, that men already sensed contagion, even if they did not understand it, and that fear readily becomes invention. In any case, ships left the Black Sea, bearing merchants, sailors, and an invisible passenger. From there, the plague moved as merchandise moved, to Constantinople, to the islands of the Aegean, to Alexandria, to the ports of Italy, to Provence and Catalonia, to every node of exchange. Europe's new arteries of trade carried not only wealth, but a hemorrhage. From Messina, the infection spread through Sicily like fire through dry reeds. When cities tried to shut their gates, they discovered that a port is a gate of water, and water is harder to bar than land. Panic is also a kind of commerce. It runs ahead of the thing feared, and in fleeing men carry it. Ships sailed from Sicily to Genoa and Venice. From them the disease entered the teeming, splendid quarrels of the Italian city-states. In 1348 it was in Florence, in Siena, in Pisa. It moved along roads where pilgrims had walked and merchants had ridden, but it needed no conscious courier. It could travel with a flea in a bale of cloth, with a rat in the hold, with a man who felt only fatigue today and fever tomorrow. The accounts that survive from those months are among the most terrible literature of Europe because they are written not from imagination, but from shock. Men accustomed to thinking of death as an individual event, an old man in bed, a knight fallen in battle, a child taken by an ordinary illness, were forced to contemplate death as weather, something that arrives in a season and spares no class. In Florence, Boccaccio would later frame his Decameron with the spectacle of a city sick to the soul, neighbors avoiding neighbors, relatives abandoning relatives, the social fabric fraying as if cut with a knife. In Siena, the great cathedral project faltered. The ambition of stone yielded to the arithmetic of graves. In Avignon, seat of the papacy, the courts of Christendom watched their clerks and supplicants drop. Pope Clement VI, according to reports, kept fires burning near him, perhaps from a notion that heat or smoke might purify the air. Even the Vicar of Christ reached for remedies that were half ritual, half medicine, and wholly human in their desperation. By the summer of 1348, the plague had crossed to southern France. Marseille is often named among its early continental footholds, and from there it moved northward along the Rhone and into the heart of the kingdom. It entered Spain, whether by land over the Pyrenees or by sea to Barcelona and Valencia, and rolled through Castile and Aragon. It reached England in 1348, probably by way of ports in the southwest, and in 1349 it tore through London, then fanned out along roads and rivers to towns and villages. It traveled into the Low Countries, into the German lands, into Switzerland and Austria. By 1350 and 1351 it had reached Scandinavia. Chronicles tell of ships arriving in Norway with crews dead or dying, ghost vessels whose first contact with shore was a sickness that could not be taxed or bargained with. Eastern Europe and Russia were not exempt. The plague's arc bent across the continent with the indifference of a natural law. The speed of the spread astonished contemporaries. They had known epidemics, but this seemed a visitation that obeyed no ordinary measure. In some places it came in waves, in others like a single overwhelming tide. Its manifestations varied. Some suffered buboes, those painful swellings in groin, armpit, or neck, accompanied by fever and delirium. Others developed a rapidly fatal lung form that could spread through breath, turning ordinary conversation into risk. Death could come within days, sometimes within hours. The living watched the sick blacken in spots, or vomit blood, or slip into a stupor from which prayer could not rouse them. It is in such moments that metaphysics becomes practical. Men asked not only, "What is this?" but "What does it mean?" And the second question, in a religious civilization, could be more urgent than the first. No account can give precise numbers for so vast and uneven a catastrophe, but all sober estimates agree that the mortality was stupendous. In many towns, a third of the inhabitants died, in others, perhaps half. In certain concentrated and unfortunate places, more. Europe as a whole may have lost something like a third to a half of its population in those years, with the usual caveat that Europe was not a unitary experience, but a mosaic of regions, each with its own density, hygiene, trade exposure, and luck. Numbers, however, are only the skeleton. The flesh is what those numbers did to households and habits. Each death is a house emptied of labor, a child without parents, a workshop without its master, a parish without its priest, a field without hands to harvest. The first social impact was the simplest and the most profound. Fear severed the ordinary bonds of touch. Charity, which Christianity had long praised, became dangerous. Affection, which families assumed as duty, became a risk. In some households, the healthy fled the sick. In others, they stayed and died together. The Chronicles preserve both kinds of conduct, and it would be cheap to judge either. When men believe that closeness kills, they must choose between love and survival, and the choice is often made not by virtue, but by terror. Nurses were hard to find. Physicians, those few trained in university medicine, could offer little beyond regimen, bleeding, purgatives, and counsel to avoid bad air. The poor, already living near the edge, suffered most. Crowded housing and poor nutrition made them vulnerable, and they had fewer places to flee. Yet the plague did not respect the poor alone. It struck monasteries and courts. It found the bishop's palace as readily as the peasant's hut. The universality of its reach was part of its psychological violence. If rank cannot protect, what is rank worth? The second impact was institutional. The Church, which had been the great organizer of medieval life, was tested at every point. The clergy were expected to administer last rites, to bury the dead, to comfort the living, to interpret the catastrophe. But priests were mortal too. Many died in the performance of their ministry. Others fled. Still others, recruited hastily to fill empty benefices, were inadequately trained. The laity watched this with a mixture of pity, anger, and disillusionment. When a priest died, the question of God became more complicated. If holiness does not confer immunity, what does it confer? Yet if the priest stayed and died, he became an emblem of charity that could inspire a new, more personal piety. The plague did not simply weaken religion, it altered its texture. It drove some toward skepticism and others toward fanaticism. It could make a man curse heaven at noon and beg it for mercy at night. Into this vacuum of explanation and control rushed movements of penitence. The flagellants, bands of men who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public, offered a visible drama of repentance. Their processions were theater and theology at once. A crowd could see sin punished in the flesh, and could imagine that such suffering might placate an angry God. Authorities sometimes tolerated them, sometimes repressed them. The institutional church, wary of uncontrolled piety and potential heresy, often condemned them. But the flagellant impulse was understandable. When medicine fails and prayer seems unanswered, men invent new forms of prayer. And there is in human beings a dark logic that says, if we cannot prevent pain, we can at least choose it, direct it, make it meaningful. Alongside penitence flourished its twin, scapegoating. The mind, besieged by chaos, longs for a culprit. In many parts of Europe, Jews became that culprit, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with foreign powers to spread disease. The accusations were not new. Medieval Europe had long carried a burden of anti-Jewish prejudice, sharpened by theological hostility and economic resentment. The plague supplied an occasion and a pretext. Pogroms broke out. Communities were expelled, massacred, burned. In some places, local rulers protected Jews, sometimes from genuine justice, sometimes from self-interest, since Jews were valuable for finance and trade. In other places, protection collapsed under popular fury or political calculation. To call this an impact is too mild. It was an atrocity nested inside a catastrophe. The disease killed bodies. Fear killed conscience. The plague also rearranged the intimate rituals of death. Medieval Christianity had cultivated a good death: confession, absolution, family gathered, the priest present, the dying reconciled to God and neighbor. The Black Death made good deaths scarce. The sick could die too quickly. Priests could not reach everyone. Families, terrified, might keep their distance. Burials became hurried. Cemeteries overflowed. Mass graves were dug. In cities, carts carried bodies through streets that had once borne bridal processions and market goods. The bell that tolled for a neighbor tolled so often that its sound lost specificity and became part of the air, like the sea or the wind. When death becomes common, it does not become easier. It becomes surreal. From these immediate wounds followed a demographic and economic upheaval that would reshape Europe for generations. Labor became scarce. Fields went untilled. Harvests rotted or were gathered late. In towns, workshops lacked apprentices and masters. The survivors found themselves paradoxically in demand. Wages rose in many places, not by charity but by necessity. Landowners and urban employers resisted. Laws were passed to control wages and bind workers to old conditions, efforts to legislate the past back into existence. In England, the Statute of Labourers, 1351, sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to compel the unemployed to work. Similar measures appeared elsewhere. But law can harass, it cannot conjure the dead. When half the hands are gone, the remaining hands discover their power. This shift strained feudal relations. The manor system had depended on a relatively abundant peasantry tied to land and obligation. With population reduced, peasants could bargain, migrate, demand commutation of labor services into rent, or simply disappear into towns. Landowners, facing lower rents and higher labor costs, sought to tighten control. Peasants, tasting leverage, sought to loosen it. The result in some regions was violence and revolt. France saw the Jacquerie, 1358, England the Peasants' Revolt, 1381, and across Europe there were lesser uprisings, strikes, and local confrontations. It would be too neat to say the plague caused these events directly. Revolts have many fathers: taxation, war, political mismanagement, long-standing grievance. But the plague altered the bargaining position of classes, and that alteration made conflict more likely. A society is never more dangerous than when the old order remains legally intact, but economically untenable. Land use changed. Marginal lands, those that required many hands for small yield, were abandoned or converted to pasture. In parts of England and elsewhere, sheep and wool became more prominent. Fewer shepherds could manage more acres than many ploughmen could cultivate. This had its own social effects: enclosure, displacement, new forms of rural inequality. In towns, guilds faced disruptions in apprenticeship and production. Some crafts declined for lack of skilled continuity. Others prospered as survivors inherited tools and shops. Wealth could concentrate suddenly when entire families vanished and property passed to a single heir. Or wealth could scatter when heirs did not exist and estates reverted to lords, churches, or municipalities. The plague was a violent mechanism of redistribution, indifferent to merit and custom. Women's roles shifted in complicated ways. With men dead, widows might take over shops, farms, and businesses. Labor scarcity could open opportunities. Yet patriarchal structures did not evaporate. In some places, authorities moved to restrict women's wages or participation. The same crisis that widened possibility also provoked backlash. Still, one can see in the decades after the plague a restless movement in social arrangements. Earlier marriages in some regions, new patterns of inheritance, and the practical empowerment of those who survived with competence in a world that suddenly valued competence over pedigree. The psychological and cultural effects were as profound as the economic. The plague intensified Europe's long conversation with death. The medieval imagination had never been casual about mortality. Churches displayed last judgments, sermons dwelt on the brevity of life, monks practiced daily remembrance of the grave. But the Black Death forced death out of the symbolic realm and into the street. Art responded. The danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged as a motif, skeletons leading pope and peasant alike in a grim equality. Tomb sculpture grew more realistic, even grotesque, depicting corpses as decaying, a candor that earlier piety had often veiled. Literature, too, shifted in tone. Writers like Petrarch, who mourned friends and correspondents lost, expressed a new fragility of human achievement. Boccaccio framed tales of wit and appetite against a background of plague, as if to say that storytelling itself is a refuge against annihilation. In England, later works would carry an undercurrent of social critique and spiritual anxiety that resonates with a society aware of its own contingency. One must also consider how the plague affected the prestige of learning. Medieval medicine, grounded in Galen and Aristotle, was not pure superstition. It was a system, coherent within its premises. It advised regimen, diet, exercise, balance of humors, because it believed disease arose from imbalance and corrupted air. It encouraged bloodletting because it imagined excess. It recommended purifying the atmosphere with fires and aromatic herbs because it believed in miasma. These measures were mostly useless against plague, and sometimes harmful. Yet it would be anachronistic to mock them. The physicians were working with the best framework available to them. What matters is that the catastrophe revealed the limits of authoritative tradition. When university learning cannot save a city, people become open, sometimes disastrously open, to other explanations. Astrology gained ground. Folk remedies multiplied. Accusations and miracles competed in the marketplace of fear. Out of failure also came beginnings. Some cities experimented with public health measures, restricting movement, isolating the sick, regulating burials, cleaning streets. The concept of quarantine, requiring ships or travelers to wait a set period before entering, developed in ports sensitive to the relationship between commerce and contagion. Such policies were imperfect and often enforced with cruelty, but they represent an early recognition that disease is not only a private misfortune, but a public matter. The medieval city, which had been a community bound by charter and wall, began to assume a new responsibility, to manage the biological as well as the political life of its inhabitants. In this sense, the plague contributed indirectly to the growth of administrative states. When death becomes a civic crisis, bureaucracy is born as a form of defense. The plague also altered the moral economy of charity. Medieval Christianity had long praised almsgiving, hospitality, and care for the sick. During the Black Death, some of the finest acts of compassion occurred, neighbors bringing food to the quarantined, monks nursing the dying, families refusing to abandon one another. But the danger of contact and the sheer scale of need overwhelmed customary charity. Institutions that had served the poor, hospitals, confraternities, monasteries, were stretched or depopulated. In the aftermath, some communities founded new charitable organizations, endowed hospitals, and created lay brotherhoods devoted to burial and care. The laity, seeing clerical shortage and sometimes clerical failure, took a more active role in religious and social life. Here again, the plague did not create a trend from nothing. It accelerated tendencies already present. Not all impacts were ennobling. There was, in many places, a loosening of restraints. Contemporary moralists complained of greed, debauchery, and irreverence among those who survived. Some people reasoned that if death is arbitrary, pleasure is rational. Others hoarded. Some exploited the panic, raising prices, selling false cures, extorting rents. Yet moralists always find sin in disaster, and their complaints may reflect less a genuine explosion of vice than the visibility of human appetite when the future is uncertain. Still, it is plausible that the plague encouraged a certain immediacy of life. When tomorrow is not promised, the austere logic of long-term virtue can feel less compelling. At the level of politics, the plague intersected with war and governance in ways that varied by region. Armies were affected. Campaigns could stall when soldiers died or when supply systems collapsed. Tax bases shrank. Governments faced financial strain precisely when they needed resources for war and relief. In some places, rulers attempted price controls, wage controls, and restrictions on movement, measures that provoked resentment. The legitimacy of authorities could suffer when they seemed powerless against disease. Yet crises can also strengthen governments if they respond effectively. The Black Death thus acted like a stress test on medieval institutions. It exposed weakness and rewarded adaptability. One of the more subtle social effects was the transformation of time. Before the plague, the future, while never guaranteed, could be imagined with a certain continuity. One expected children to grow, apprentices to become masters, harvests to return. After the plague, the future acquired an element of interruption. Men began to live with the knowledge that history can lurch. This is not merely psychological, it changes behavior. It influences saving and spending, marriage and fertility, piety and skepticism. Demography itself reflects this. After the initial catastrophe, birth rates in some areas rose, perhaps as survivors sought to rebuild families and labor forces. Yet recurrent outbreaks in later decades, the plague did not politely exit in 1351, kept the memory fresh. Europe would live with plague as a periodic visitor for centuries, though never again with quite the same continental shock as the first assault. It is tempting to treat the Black Death as a single event, an onslaught and an aftermath, but its reality was more like a long scar. The first wave, 1347 to 1351, was the deepest cut. Later waves, including significant recurrences in the 1360s and beyond, reopened wounds. This repetition shaped society in ways different from a one-time disaster. A one-time disaster can be remembered and commemorated. A recurring disaster becomes a condition. People develop habits around it: flight, isolation, resignation, ritual, urban planning, poor relief, burial practices. All could be influenced by the expectation that plague might return. In considering the social impact, one must not overlook the countryside. Much of the drama in Chronicles is urban, because cities produced literate observers, and because death there was visible in crowds. But rural Europe was the majority, and there too the plague worked its transformations. Villages lost clergy and elders. Customary knowledge could vanish with a generation. Some settlements were abandoned altogether, leaving deserted villages whose empty foundations later archaeologists would find. Where fields lay fallow, forests reclaimed them. The landscape itself shifted, as if nature, given a brief reprieve from human numbers, took back what it had lent. In places where lords could not find tenants, they offered better terms. In places where peasants could choose among lands, they migrated. The rigid map of medieval obligation became more fluid. The plague also affected education and the transmission of culture. Universities and schools suffered interruptions. Students and masters died. Yet the long-term result was not a collapse, but a reconfiguration. With clerical positions vacant, opportunities opened for new men. Ecclesiastical benefices could be filled by younger or less traditional candidates. In administration, too, vacancies allowed advancement. The social ladder, which had always existed but had been narrow, widened slightly when so many rungs were removed. This contributed to a slow reshaping of elites. More men of middling origin could rise, and with them came new expectations and attitudes. If one seeks a single phrase to describe the plague's social impact, it might be, it made the implicit explicit. It revealed that society is not merely a set of laws or beliefs, but a living equilibrium of bodies. How many there are, where they are, how they move, what they eat, what they can afford, what they fear. It revealed that the Church, for all its spiritual authority, depends on the physical presence of clergy. It revealed that the Lord's power depends on the availability of labor. It revealed that cities, proud of their walls, are porous to what comes in ships and breath. It revealed that prejudice, normally contained by routine, can become murderous when panic loosens restraint. And it revealed that compassion, often sentimental in sermon, can become heroic when it risks death. Yet to stop at revelation is to miss the deeper history. The Black Death did not create modern Europe. It did not invent capitalism or individualism or the Renaissance, but it altered the tempo of change. By reducing population, it increased per capita resources for survivors in some regions, more land per person, higher wages, more bargaining power. It weakened certain feudal bonds and strengthened certain market relations. It pushed governments toward regulation and public health. It changed the Church's relationship with the laity and contributed to currents of criticism that, over the long run, would feed reform movements. It influenced art and literature by pressing mortality into consciousness with a violence that no allegory could match. Even so, the historian must resist neatness. Europe did not respond uniformly. Some regions recovered quickly, others languished. Some lords adapted by leasing land and accepting cash rents. Others fought to restore labor obligations. Some cities developed effective quarantines. Others remained vulnerable. Some communities turned inward, policing strangers and minorities. Others extended charity. Human societies are not machines with predictable outputs. They are collections of choices made under pressure, and pressure can bring out every human possibility. In the end, perhaps the most enduring social impact was not economic or institutional, but spiritual in the broad sense. The plague altered Europe's sense of the relationship between man and the universe. The medieval world had been hierarchical. God above, angels and saints, kings and bishops, lords and peasants, each in place. The Black Death did not abolish hierarchy, but it mocked it. It reminded men that the ultimate sovereignty belongs to nature, or, in medieval terms, to God's inscrutable will, operating through agents no knight could fight and no bishop could excommunicate. This humiliation could deepen faith because it made God feel nearer and more terrifying, or it could deepen doubt because it made the world feel cruelly arbitrary. Both responses are found in the aftermath, and Europe would live for centuries in the tension between them. When the first great wave receded, survivors looked out on quieter streets, emptier fields, and a silence that was not peace, but absence. The dead were not merely lost, they were missing from every ordinary act. A widow needing bread felt the lack of hands that used to help. A master in a guild hall heard the echo of a voice that used to argue. A priest at Mass saw gaps in the pews that were not temporary. The plague's social impact was therefore a continuous experience of subtraction, and subtraction is not only loss, it is also a grim kind of liberation. With fewer people, some had more room to breathe, more leverage to demand wages, more land to cultivate, more chance to rise. The moral ambiguity of that fact is part of the plague's legacy. Catastrophe can produce opportunity, but it is opportunity purchased at a price too high to celebrate. If one returns, finally, to the harbor at Messina, the galley, the quiet, the bruised swellings, one sees in miniature the larger story. The ship was not a demon's chariot, it was a normal vessel of trade. The sailors were not villains, they were workers. The city was not uniquely sinful, it was ordinarily alive. The catastrophe entered through the ordinary. That is the sober lesson that history repeats with weary insistence. The greatest transformations often arrive not with trumpets, but with a routine event, a ship docking, a traveler coughing, a market opening, until, suddenly, the routines themselves become the conduits of ruin. Europe survived the Black Death, and in surviving, it changed. But it did not change because it discovered a grand new philosophy in the midst of pain. It changed because, stripped of millions of lives, it had no choice but to reorganize itself around the living and to carry, like an inherited trauma, the memory that the foundations of society are mortal too.